A crystal glass shatters against marble floor. A Mafia boss freezes, staring at the slender wrist of a woman pouring his whiskey.
Elizabeth.
And in the silence that follows, one whispered name unravels 15 years of grief, rage, and carefully buried hope. Elizabeth. This is not just a story about organized crime or second chances. It's about a woman who sacrificed everything to escape a killer's crosshairs, a man who became a monster mourning a ghost, and a scar that proves some wounds never truly heal. One mark on delicate skin becomes the thread that pulls apart carefully constructed lies, forcing two people to confront whether the past can ever truly be buried, or if love is the one debt that must always be repaid. A Mafia boss drops his glass. A scar he thought he'd never see again. A woman who should be dead. And you're about to scroll past without knowing if she survives the next 5 minutes. Subscribe and drop your location in the comments if you need to know what happens when the Russians reach that penthouse door. Or don't. Some people are comfortable with unfinished stories. Your choice. A maid reaches across the mahogany desk to refill his whiskey, and as her sleeve slides back, Pedro Navarro sees it. A jagged scar cutting across her wrist like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. The crystal glass slips from his fingers, whiskey and shattered glass exploding across the floor of his Miami penthouse. Elizabeth. The name comes out strangled, disbelieving, a ghost rising from a grave he'd visited in his nightmares for 15 years. The penthouse falls into a suffocating silence as Pedro stares at the woman in the burgundy maid's uniform, his face draining of all color before flushing crimson, then ghostly white again. The scar in question was unmistakable, a memento from the night fire had consumed his world, the night he'd held her bleeding body and sworn vengeance on everyone responsible, the night he became the monster Miami whispered about in dark corners. His mind hurtled back to 2010, to a woman named Elizabeth Torres who had vanished in smoke and flames, taking with her the last shred of humanity he possessed. Pedro's security team moved instantly, hands reaching for weapons concealed beneath tailored jackets, misreading a shock as danger until he raised a single trembling hand to stop them. The maid, Elizabeth, if this impossible moment was real, stood frozen, her serving tray wavering in her grip, suddenly aware she'd triggered something catastrophic. Those dark eyes he'd once memorized now widened with something between recognition and terror. "It's you?" Pedro breathed, rising slowly from his leather chair, the words less question than prayer. His voice carried 15 years of grief, rage, and something more dangerous, hope. The woman took an involuntary step backward, her free hand instinctively covering the scar as if she could hide the evidence that had already condemned her. Elizabeth's lips parted, then closed, her composure cracking like ice under pressure. She'd known this risk when she took this position, when desperation had driven her back into the orbit of the one man she'd sworn never to see again. But knowing and experiencing were entirely different beasts, and the raw intensity in Pedro's gaze stripped away every carefully rehearsed lie. "You died," he said, and the accusation in those 2 words could have shattered steel. He moved around the desk with predatory grace, years of calculated violence evident in every controlled movement, but his hands shook as he reached toward her. "I buried you. I burned half of Miami looking for who took you from me." His security chief, Antonio, shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances with the other guards stationed throughout the penthouse. In 12 years of service, he'd never seen Pedro Navarro display emotion beyond cold calculation. The man who'd built an empire on fear and blood now looked like he'd witnessed a resurrection. Elizabeth's training warred with panic. She'd spent 15 years becoming invisible, building a life from ash and false names, staying 3 steps ahead of the underworld that had tried to erase her. And now, in one careless moment, one exposed scar, every wall she'd constructed was collapsing. "I need to go," she whispered, setting down the tray with trembling hands. "You're not going anywhere." Pedro's voice dropped to something between command and plea, stopping her mid-turn. He closed the distance between them, and she could see the tattoos snaking up his neck, the hard lines grief and violence had carved into a face she'd once known soft with laughter. Not until you tell me how. How you survived. Why you left me believing you were dead. The other staff members had fled at the first sign of drama, understanding that proximity to Pedro Navarro's personal business was a dangerous place to be. Only his inner circle remained, watching this impossible scene unfold. Their untouchable boss, the man who'd turned ruthlessness into an art form, undone by a woman in a maid's uniform. Elizabeth met his eyes finally, and in them Pedro saw everything he needed to know. The truth, the fear, the woman he'd loved still breathing beneath layers of survival and secrets. You want to know why? Her voice gained strength even as her body tensed for flight. Look at what you became, Pedro. I didn't die that night. But the man I loved did. The words hit harder than any bullet. Pedro's jaw clenched, years of justification and violence crystallizing into a single, devastating realization. She'd chosen to disappear rather than be found. The empire he'd built, the revenge he'd enacted, the monster he'd become, all of it had been for a ghost who'd chosen to stay dead. I looked for you everywhere, he said, and the vulnerability in his voice made Antonio shift toward the door, suddenly aware this was far too intimate for witnesses. Every lead, every rumor, every unmarked grave in 3 states. I know. Elizabeth's hand dropped from her wrist, revealing the scar fully, a permanent reminder of the night their world had burned. I made sure you couldn't find me. Made sure no one could. Because staying dead was the only way to stay alive. The penthouse seemed to contract around them, years of separation and transformation collapsing into this single electric moment. Pedro's men watched their boss's face cycle through emotions they didn't have names for: grief, rage, longing, betrayal, all warring for dominance. And now? Pedro asked, his voice barely audible over the Miami traffic humming 40 floors below. You came back. Why? The question carried weight beyond words. 15 years of mourning, of becoming someone unrecognizable, of building an empire on the foundation of her absence. Elizabeth's chin lifted slightly, and there, beneath the fear and the survival instinct, Pedro saw a flash of the defiance he'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd never been intimidated by his reputation or his violence. I came back, she said quietly, because some debts can't be outrun forever. The memory hit Pedro like a physical blow as he stood in his penthouse, Elizabeth's presence dragging him back 15 years to a dive bar in Little Havana where the air smelled of rum and regret. He'd been nobody then, well, nobody important. Just another soldier climbing the ranks, taking orders from men who'd be dead within 5 years, making the kind of money that felt impressive until you saw how the real bosses lived. The bar was called La Estrella, a peeling neon star marking the entrance to a world where cops didn't ask questions and criminals didn't start fights they couldn't finish. Elizabeth had been behind that bar, pouring drinks with efficiency that spoke of years perfecting the art of being invisible. Dark hair pulled back, no makeup, eyes that assessed every customer before they opened their mouths. Most bartenders in that neighborhood learned to read danger. Elizabeth had turned it into a sixth sense. He'd noticed her immediately, though he'd pretended not to. Pedro Navarro didn't chase bartenders. He had ambition, plans that required focus and ruthlessness, not distractions wrapped in a work-stained apron. But she'd seen through him that first night, slid his whiskey across the scarred wood bar, and said, "You're different from the others." Not flirtatious. Not impressed. Just observant. Like, she'd cataloged every criminal who'd sat on that stool and found him an anomaly worth noting. Different how, he'd asked, caught off guard by her directness. You're pretending to be comfortable here. She'd wiped down the bar with methodical precision. But your eyes keep checking exits. You sit where you can see the door. You don't relax, even when you laugh. A pause, then quieter. You're smart enough to be afraid. That means you might survive. That conversation had been the beginning of everything, the late nights after closing when he'd help her stack shares while she shared her dreams of opening a legitimate restaurant, the stolen moments in the storage room where professionalism dissolved into desperate kisses, The morning she'd shown up at his apartment with coffee and the news that his boss was planning to have him killed. She'd saved his life 3 times before they'd ever said, "I love you." Once with a warning. Once by lying to his rivals about his whereabouts. Once by stitching up a knife wound in her cramped bathroom while he bit down on a rolled towel to keep from screaming. The warnings had started around month 4. His lieutenant at the time, a man named Vega with breath like cigarettes and ambition like poison, had pulled him aside outside La Estrella. The bartender. "You need to stop." Not advice. A threat disguised as concern. "It's nothing." Pedro had lied. "It's everything." Vega had corrected, lighting a cigarette with deliberate slowness. "The moment you love something, you give them a weapon. And, in this business, weapons get used." Pedro had ignored him. He'd been climbing too fast, accumulating power and territory, while Elizabeth became the only clean thing in his increasingly bloody world. She was his escape, his conscience, the person who looked at him and still saw a man instead of a monster in training. But others had noticed too. Rival families. Ambitious subordinates. The Russian crew moving into South Beach who saw relationships as leverage and loyalty as weakness. Elizabeth had known before he did. She'd started carrying a knife. Started varying her route home. Started looking over her shoulder with the same paranoid efficiency she'd once observed in him. "Leave," he told her one night after a particularly close call, some idiot from a competing crew following her home. "Go to California. New York. Anywhere but here." She'd pressed her palm against his chest, feeling his heartbeat. "If I leave, you'll have nothing left to fight for. You'll become exactly what they expect you to be." She'd been right. And she'd been catastrophically wrong. Because 3 months later, they'd come for her anyway. The call had come at 2:47 a.m., a number Pedro didn't recognize, a voice he'd never forget, raspy, amused, speaking Spanish with a Cuban accent thick as smoke. "Your little bartender is pretty," when she screams. He'd been across town, finalizing a deal that would triple his territory. By the time he reached La Estrella, the building was already swallowed in flames, orange and red licking at the Miami night sky, like the mouth of hell itself. Pedro had run toward the fire while everyone else ran away. The heat had been unbearable, singeing his eyebrows, melting the fabric of his shirt, but he'd pushed through the shattered front entrance, screaming her name until his throat was raw. The bar where they'd first spoken was engulfed, bottles exploding like gunfire, the ceiling groaning its surrender to gravity and flame. He'd found her in the back hallway, near the storage room where they'd stolen so many moments. She was crumpled against the wall, blood soaking through her shirt from knife wounds he'd count later, 7 in total, and her wrists sliced deep where she'd tried to defend herself. The scar that would haunt him for 15 years was being born in that moment, flesh open to bone. Elizabeth. He'd gathered her into his arms, her blood mixing with the soot covering his hands. Her eyes had fluttered open, unfocused, pupils blown wide with shock and pain. "Stay with me. Stay with me." She'd tried to speak, lips moving, but only blood had emerged. The paramedics had pulled him away as the ceiling collapsed, as La Estrella became a funeral pyre for the man he used to be. The hospital had been sterile white, and endless waiting. 23 hours of pacing, of his hands still stained with her blood despite washing them raw, of doctors with grave expressions and carefully neutral voices. When they'd finally emerged, the words had been clinical, devastating. "We did everything we could." Pedro had demanded to see the body. They'd refused, citing the extent of the injuries, the fire damage, the mercy of memory over reality. He'd torn apart that hospital room, shattered equipment worth thousands, and had to be sedated by 4 security guards and a needle full of something that made the world go black. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Elizabeth had woken during transport, had grabbed the paramedic's wrist with surprising strength for someone hovering at death's door, and whispered 3 words that changed everything. "Tell him nothing." She disappeared into witness protection protocols that didn't officially exist, into the network of people who specialized in making inconvenient survivors vanish. The doctors had lied on Pedro's behalf, believing they were granting him closure. They'd created a death certificate for a woman whose heart was still beating 3 floors above where he'd raged. Elizabeth had made that choice in a morphine haze, watching news footage of Pedro's retaliation through a hospital television. He'd burned through Miami like a plague, dismantling the Cuban crew responsible with methodical brutality that made headlines. 7 dead in the first week. 15 by the end of the month. He'd become the monster everyone had warned her he would be. Except this time, there was no her to pull him back. She'd watched him transform into exactly what Vega had predicted, a man with nothing left to lose, which made him the most dangerous kind of weapon. And she'd known, with the clarity that only comes from nearly dying, that if he knew she was alive, he'd never stop. Never be satisfied. Never become anything but her destroyer and protector both, suffocating her with the weight of his guilt and rage. So Elizabeth Torres had died on paper, while the woman who survived learned to live with a new name, a new life, and the knowledge that sometimes love meant letting someone mourn you. For 15 years, it had almost worked. Underscore 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 underscore. You just watched Elizabeth make an impossible choice. Let the man she loved become a monster to save them both. But here's the uncomfortable question. Was she right? Or did her silence create something far worse than the truth ever could? Most people scroll past stories like this thinking they'd choose differently. They'd be honest. They'd fight for love no matter the cost. They'd never let someone they care about descend into darkness. But you're still here. Which means you understand something darker, that sometimes the cruelest thing we do to people we love is exactly what we think will save them. Subscribe if you're brave enough to see whether mercy and cowardice are really that different. Because this story doesn't owe you a comfortable answer. And neither does life. Or don't. Keep scrolling. Pretend you wouldn't have done exactly what Elizabeth did when the world was burning and survival meant becoming someone else entirely. The choice is yours. Just like it was hers. Pedro had his men clear the penthouse within minutes, leaving only Antonio stationed outside the reinforced door. The silence that followed their departure was suffocating, broken only by the hum of Miami traffic 40 floors below and the sound of Elizabeth's controlled breathing. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, arms wrapped around herself like she could hold her fractured composure together through sheer will. Pedro watched her from across the room, afraid that moving too quickly would make her bolt, that she'd vanish again, and this time he'd never find her. 15 years, he finally said, the words scraping out like gravel. You let me believe you were dead for 15 years. I was dead. Elizabeth didn't turn from the window. The woman you knew burned in that fire. I'm just what survived. Don't. His voice sharpened, anger bleeding through the shock. Don't give me philosophy when I want the truth. You were alive, breathing, walking around while He cut himself off, jaw clenching against words that felt too raw to speak. While you what? She turned finally, and the look in her eyes was harder than he remembered, forged in the same fire that had tried to kill her. While you slaughtered half of Miami. While you built an empire on the bodies of everyone you thought was responsible. I watched the news, Pedro. I saw what you became. The accusation hung between them like smoke. Pedro moved closer, slow and deliberate, the predator instincts he'd honed over 15 years warring with the memory of the man who'd once stacked chairs while she counted tips. I became that for you. Because of you.
No.
The word was sharp, final. You became that for yourself. Because it was easier to be a monster with a purpose than a man with a conscience. She backed toward the door, hand reaching for the handle. I need to leave. This was a mistake. Coming back here was. You came back. Pedro closed the distance, not touching her, but blocking her exit with his presence alone. After 15 years of hiding, you took a job in my house. Why? Elizabeth's hand dropped from the door. For a moment, Vulnerability cracked through her armor, and Pedro saw the truth before she spoke it. Because I'm dying. The words hit him like a physical blow. What? The fire damaged my lungs. Scar tissue, complications. The doctors gave me 6 months, maybe 8. She met his eyes, and there was no plea for pity in them, just exhausted honesty. I needed to see you one more time. See if anything of the man I loved still existed, or if I'd sacrificed everything for a ghost. Pedro's world tilted. He'd survived 15 years of violence, betrayal, and blood without flinching. But this, her standing here, dying, having come back to him only because time was running out, this was breaking something fundamental inside his chest. You don't get to do that. His voice dropped to something dangerous, possessive. You don't get to show up dying and think I'll just let you go again. You don't have a choice, Elizabeth said, but her certainty wavered. The moment shattered when Pedro's phone buzzed. Once. Twice. 3 times in rapid succession, the emergency signal. He grabbed it, read Antonio's message, and felt ice flood his veins. Boss. We have a problem. 3 cars just pulled up to the building. Russians. They're asking about the woman. Elizabeth saw his expression change. What is it? Pedro looked at her, at the woman who died and lived and come back to haunt him, and realized the nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning again. They know you're here, he said quietly. Words already out. The dead woman is alive, and every enemy I've made in 15 years just found their leverage. Elizabeth's face went pale. How long do we have? Minutes. Pedro was already moving, grabbing his jacket, checking the Glock holstered at his back. Maybe less. She'd come back to see if the man she loved still existed. She was about to find out if the monster could save her, or if history was simply repeating itself with a different fire, a different night, and the same inevitable ending. Outside, elevator cables hummed, carrying death upward in expensive suits and cold intention. The first photograph arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the mansion's service entrance like a knife between ribs. Elizabeth's face in profile, captured through the kitchen window 3 days prior. No note. No demands. Just proof that someone was watching, and they wanted Pedro to know it. He found her in the library that afternoon, still wearing the simple uniform she'd insisted on keeping despite his repeated offers of anything else. Everything else. The photograph lay between them on his desk like evidence at a crime scene. Victor Reyes, Pedro said, the name tasting like poison. He was my father's enforcer before he tried to carve out his own territory. I put him in the ground 15 years ago. Apparently, his son disagrees with my accounting. Elizabeth's fingers trembled slightly as she touched the photograph's edge. How many, Pedro? How many people want to finish what was started? Does it matter? His voice was too controlled, the kind of calm that preceded hurricanes. They won't get close enough to try. But they already had. That was the point of the photograph. By Thursday, 2 more had arrived. Elizabeth at the market she'd visited once, believing she had freedom. Elizabeth through the window of the cafe where she'd met her sister for the first time in 15 years. Each image a violation, a promise, a countdown to something inevitable. Pedro's response was surgical and overwhelming. Armed men materialized at every corner of the estate. Her movements were restricted, then monitored, then essentially prohibited. He installed cameras in hallways she'd once walked freely, assigned guards to shadow her steps, transformed the sprawling mansion into an elegant cage with bulletproof glass and biometric locks. This is temporary, he told her on the 5th day, when she found herself unable to open the garden door without triggering 3 different security protocols. Until I've eliminated the threat. Which threat? The question emerged sharper than she intended. The one sending photographs, or the life I was trying to rebuild? His jaw tightened. I'm protecting you. You're suffocating me. Elizabeth stood in the center of what had once been a sanctuary and now felt like a museum, where she was both curator and exhibit. This is exactly what I ran from, Pedro. Not the violence itself, but the cage you built and called it love. I called it survival. His voice dropped to something dangerous and desperate. You don't understand what these men are capable of. I have the scars to prove exactly what they're capable of. She pulled back her sleeve, exposing the familiar mark on her wrist. I survived them once without your protection. I survived 15 years in hiding while you played king of a bloody empire. Don't insult me by pretending I don't understand the stakes. That night, a car exploded 3 blocks from the estate. A warning, or a failed attempt, the distinction hardly mattered. She heard the detonation from her bedroom, watched Pedro's silhouette appear in her doorway within seconds, weapon drawn. Every muscle coiled for violence. Pack a bag, he said. I'm moving you to the safe house.
No.
Elizabeth. I didn't survive this long to become your prisoner. Her voice was steady despite the fear coursing through her. If you lock me away, they win. I become what they always wanted me to be, leverage. A weakness. A ghost haunting your decisions. Better a ghost than a corpse. The words hung between them like the photograph had, proof that some distances couldn't be crossed by desire alone. The body started appearing on the 3rd week. Not at the estate. Pedro had enough restraint for that, but close enough that the message reached Elizabeth through whispered conversations between terrified staff and the barely concealed bloodstains on his shirts when he returned at dawn. Victor Reyes's son was the first. Found in his car with a single bullet and a photograph of Elizabeth pinned to his chest. Then 2 associates, a banker who'd laundered money for the old regime, a lawyer who'd made inquiries about property records near the estate. Pedro was systematically erasing anyone who'd ever known her name, ever seen her face, ever posed even a theoretical threat. You're killing people who might not even mean me harm, Elizabeth confronted him in his office, her voice shaking with fury and something that felt horrifyingly like complicity. A banker, Pedro? A lawyer asking questions. The banker funded the attack 15 years ago. He didn't look up from the documents he was signing, his hand steady, as if authorizing death was no different than approving household expenses. The lawyer was gathering information on your sister's address. These aren't innocent men. And you're the judge? Jury? Executioner? Yes. Simple, absolute, terrifying in its certainty. I have been for a very long time, Elizabeth. You knew what I was when you loved me. I loved a man who was capable of terrible things, not one who drowned himself in them and called it devotion. He finally looked at her then, and the hollowness in his eyes made her breath catch. Tell me how else to keep you safe. Give me another option that doesn't end with you bleeding out in my arms while I watch. She had no answer. That was the cruelest part. The breaking point came when she discovered he'd been tracking her sister. Files on Maria's husband, her children, daily routines photographed and documented with the same cold precision he applied to his enemies. Elizabeth found them by accident, filed neatly in his desk drawer beneath contracts and kill orders. She's my sister. Elizabeth's hands shook as she held the photographs of her nephew's school. She has nothing to do with this. She's a vulnerability. Pedro's voice was clinical, distant, the tone of a man solving equations rather than destroying lives. Anyone who knows you're alive is a potential leak. I'm not tracking her to hurt her. I'm tracking her to know if anyone else is. Do you hear yourself? Elizabeth threw the files across his desk, papers scattering like accusations. You've turned everyone I love into surveillance targets. You've murdered men on suspicion. You've locked me in this beautiful prison and convinced yourself it's salvation. It's survival. It's obsession. The words ripped from her throat, 15 years of running and hiding and suffocating finally exploding into open air. You didn't get me back, Pedro. You acquired me. Another possession to guard, another asset to protect. I'm not a person to you anymore. I'm a wound you can't stop pressing on. He stood then, moving around the desk with predatory grace, and she saw it clearly, the monster wearing the face of the man she'd loved. You want to know if I can change? If the violence is something I can shed like old skin. He was close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the ones she used to trace with her fingertips. I can't. This is who I became when I lost you. And I will burn this entire city to ash before I lose you again. Then you've already lost me, she whispered. Because I can't love a man who's forgotten how to be human. The attack came at 2:47 a.m. on a moonless Thursday, precisely when the guard rotation created a 17-second gap in the estate's northeastern perimeter. Elizabeth would later realize that kind of specificity only came from inside knowledge, from someone who'd walked these halls and counted the seconds between safety and catastrophe. The explosion took out the generator first, plunging the mansion into darkness before backup systems could engage. In that brief window of confusion, they came through 3 entry points simultaneously, professionals who moved like shadows and killed with the efficiency of men who'd done this 1,000 times before. Elizabeth woke to gunfire, and Pedro's hand clamped over her mouth, his body already positioned between her and the door. "Stay silent. Stay low." His voice was barely audible beneath the staccato rhythm of automatic weapons echoing through the corridors. "There's a passage behind the bookshelf. Go. Not without you. Go." He pressed a gun into her trembling hands, and she saw the calculation in his eyes, the terrible mathematics of who might survive the next 5 minutes. "The passage leads to the garage. Keys in the 3rd Mercedes. Drive to." The door exploded inward, wood and brass fragmenting like shrapnel. Pedro moved with brutal precision, putting down 2 men before Elizabeth could process they were there. But there were more, always more, and she heard him grunt as a bullet found flesh. She ran. Hated herself for it, but ran, because staying meant dying, and dying meant he'd failed at the only thing he'd cared about for 3 weeks. The passage was narrow and dark, smelling of old stone and older secrets. Behind her, the gunfire intensified, a symphony of violence that told her Pedro was buying her escape with his own blood. The garage was chaos. 2 of Pedro's men lay dead near the vehicles, their weapons gone, their eyes staring at nothing. The 3rd Mercedes sat where he'd promised, but standing beside it was Marcus, Pedro's second-in-command, the man who'd eaten at their table, who'd sworn loyalty on his children's lives. "I'm sorry, Elizabeth." He didn't sound sorry. He sounded tired and rich, and already calculating what Victor Reyes's successor had promised for this betrayal. "It's just business. You understand." She understood that the gun Pedro had given her felt impossibly heavy and that her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She understood that Marcus had 3 decades of killing experience, and she had 15 years of running. She understood that the only man who could save her was bleeding somewhere in the mansion above, if he wasn't already dead. "Victor's dead," she said, buying seconds she didn't have. "Pedro killed him. His nephew isn't. Neither are the Court of a Family, the Maldonado crew, or the 6 other organizations who've pooled resources for tonight." Marcus moved closer, his weapon steady where hers wavered. "You're the peace offering, sweetheart. Your death ends the war Pedro started when he decided one woman was worth more than the entire underworld's goodwill." The first shot surprised them both, not from Marcus's gun or hers, but from the garage entrance where Pedro stood, blood soaking through his shirt, his aim unwavering despite the way his left arm hung useless at his side. Marcus fell without ceremony, without last words, just a body adding to the evening's count. "The Mercedes," Pedro gasped, already moving toward her with the desperate momentum of a man running on all alone. "We have maybe 90 seconds before." The garage doors exploded inward, and Elizabeth realized with crystalline horror that 90 seconds had been optimistic. They were surrounded, outgunned, and the empire Pedro had built was finally demanding its payment in full. They made it to the Mercedes through a hail of bullets that turned glass and metal into crystalline rain. Pedro drove one-handed, his injured arm pressed against his side, blood pooling on leather seats that cost more than most people's yearly salary. Elizabeth held pressure on the wound and tried not to calculate how much blood a human body could lose before the mathematics became fatal. "The port," he gasped. "I have a boat. We can. They'll have the port covered." Elizabeth's voice was steadier than her hands. "They'll have everything covered, Pedro. This isn't just an attack. It's a coordinated elimination." He knew she was right. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched, the same expression he'd worn when signing death warrants, when making impossible calculations about acceptable losses. Except this time, the only acceptable loss was himself. "There's a warehouse on Brickell," he said finally. "Neutral territory. If I can get there, make contact with the Commission. The Commission wants you dead." The words tasted like ash. "Your empire threatened theirs. I'm just the excuse they needed to finally move against you." The Mercedes skidded into an abandoned parking structure, the kind of place where Miami's glossy surface cracked to reveal the rot beneath. Pedro killed the engine, and in the sudden silence, they could hear sirens in the distance, the city's indifferent response to gunfire and chaos. "I can offer them terms," he said, reloading his weapon with practiced efficiency despite his injury. "Territory concessions, profit sharing. They want power, not bloodshed. They want both." Elizabeth took the gun he'd given her hours ago, the weight no longer foreign in her palm. "And they'll get it unless you give them something they want more." His eyes met hers, understanding crystallizing into horror.
"No."
"You walk away." Her voice didn't shake anymore. Somewhere between the mansion and this moment, she'd found something harder than fear, sharper than survival instinct. "Disappear like I did. Give them your territory, your operations, everything. They get the empire, and we get to live. They'll never believe I'd just walk away. I'd be a threat as long as I'm breathing. Then make them believe." She moved closer, pressing her hand over his heart, feeling it thunder against her palm. "The Commission knows you built this empire because of me. Let them think losing me broke you, that you'd rather have nothing than rule without me. Elizabeth, you told me you'd burn the city to ash before losing me again." Her eyes held his, unflinching. "Prove it. Burn your empire instead." 3 cars pulled into the structure, doors opening with synchronized precision. Men emerged with weapons and cold eyes. Commission enforcers, the underworld's judges and executioners. At the center stood an older man Elizabeth recognized from Pedro's files, Antonio Vega, the Commission's head, a man who'd built kingdoms on other people's graves. "Pedro Navarro." Vega's voice echoed off concrete. "You've caused considerable disruption." Pedro stepped forward, and Elizabeth saw him make the choice in real time. Watch the Mafia boss armor crack and the man beneath emerge, raw and bleeding and finally, impossibly, human. "I'm out." He let his weapon clatter to the ground. "My territory, my operations, my assets. Take it all. I want guaranteed safe passage for her and immunity from retaliation. In exchange, I disappear. You'll never hear from me again." Vega studied them both with eyes that had witnessed countless executions and betrayals. "And if we simply kill you both now?" Elizabeth stepped beside Pedro, gun steady in her hand, aimed at Vega's heart. "Then you'll need a new commission head, and the chaos that follows will make Pedro's empire look like a minor inconvenience." Vega smiled. Perhaps the woman is the dangerous one after all. The apartment in Lisbon was small, overlooking a narrow street where laundry hung between weathered buildings and the smell of grilled sardines drifted through open windows. It cost a fraction of what Pedro's wine cellar once did, and some mornings he woke disoriented, reaching for power he no longer possessed, for the weight of a weapon he'd sworn never to carry again. Elizabeth found him on the balcony 6 weeks after they'd arrived, coffee growing cold in his hands, staring at cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of ordinary footsteps. "Regrets?" she asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted the answer. "Every day." His honesty had become sharper in exile, untempered by the performance of power. "I built something that took 2 decades to construct. Walked away in a single night. Some mornings I wake up, and the absence feels like amputation." She sat beside him, their shoulders touching in the cramped space. Below, an old woman argued with a fishmonger in rapid Portuguese, their voices rising and falling in the rhythm of a life untouched by violence. "Do you wish you'd made a different choice?" He turned to her then, and she saw the man she'd loved beneath the scar tissue of what he'd become. "I wish I'd made it 15 years ago. Before I let grief turn me into something unrecognizable. Before I needed to lose everything to remember what mattered." The Commission had kept their word, testament to how thoroughly Pedro's surrender had neutered any threat he represented. His territory had been divided, his operations absorbed, his name relegated to cautionary tale status in underworld mythology. Antonio Vega had even sent a bottle of wine on their 1-month anniversary of exile, a gesture that felt equal parts mockery and respect. Elizabeth's sister had written twice, careful letters that said nothing of substance, but everything about forgiveness. The nieces and nephews Elizabeth had only seen in surveillance photographs were real now, their crayon drawings magnet to a refrigerator in this tiny kitchen where no one died and nothing exploded. "I started teaching English yesterday," Elizabeth said, "at a language school near the university. The pay is terrible and the students barely listen, but no one there knows my name or what it costs to speak it out loud." Pedro's hand found hers, calloused and scarred, capable of terrible violence and impossible gentleness. "I've been thinking about the boat repair shop down at the marina." The owner mentioned needing help. "You don't know anything about boats." "I didn't know anything about being human either. Apparently, I'm learning." The ghost of a smile crossed his face, unfamiliar and fragile. "The owner is 73 and only cares that I show up on time and don't steal from the register. It's the lowest stakes employment I've had since I was 16. They sat in silence as the city woke around them, ordinary and chaotic and blessedly anonymous. Elizabeth thought about the girl she'd been, falling in love with danger wrapped in charm. About the woman who'd survived fire and loss and 15 years of erasure. About who she might become in a place where the past couldn't find her and the future wasn't written in blood. "Can we do this?" she asked finally. "Build something real from all the wreckage?" Pedro lifted her wrist, pressing his lips to the scar that had started everything, that had ended everything, that had somehow led them here. "I don't know. But I'd rather fail at this than succeed at anything else." Below, church bells marked the hour. The fishmonger and the old woman reached a compromise. Laundry swayed in the salt-tinged breeze. And two people who'd survived the unsurvivable began the harder work of learning to simply live.